Scramble by I Had Him on the Ropes, Carter Reed, and Rory Gone Maddie, Rose Tinted Days. Chapter 2, Day 5. Alfred, it seemed, had finally reached his limit. He'd been relatively gracious, giving Bruce space for nearly a week after what they were calling the incident, but from his pursed lips and the heaviness of his gaze, things were coming to a head. In fact, had Bruce not already clad himself in Kevlar and a black cape as soon as the sun began to dip below the horizon, he was sure his surrogate father would have already staged the intervention he'd been planning for several days. In the end, Alfred waited until he'd stripped himself of his armor, hastily pulled on a t-shirt to hide the array of bruises that a pair of coked-out would-be robbers had managed to inflict before being quickly knocked unconscious and handed off to the nearest member of Gordon's team he could find, and slipped through the secret entrance into Wayne Manor before bouncing. "Master Bruce," he greeted, tone anything but kind. It sent mere shivers down his spine because while Batman may not fear anything, the notion of disappointing Alfred came considerably close. "Alfred," he returned curtly, continuing forward and ignoring the sensation of panic when the butler fell into step beside him. "As you well know, sir, I have been rather generous this last week with your erratic behavior," he began stiffly. "Erratic?" Bruce asked, stopping abruptly and turning, trying to ignore how his eyebrows had jumped into his hairline. "Yes, erratic," Alfred retorted, gaze frosty. "I fail to see how I've been erratic, Alfred." Bruce snorted, starting to walk once more. "These past few days alone, you have taken several unnecessary risks, refused assistance from Commissioner Gordon, and, on one occasion, demanded that he leave your case alone. You went looking for a fight with Catwoman, despite her relatively lackluster presence in the criminal world at the moment, and when that failed, you went looking for Ivy. You have refused no less than 9 meals, choosing instead to drink your way through the already depleted Wayne liquor reserves, or spend several hours lugging tires from one end of the cave to the other. And just this evening you engaged several substance-abusing criminals wielding machetes after little more than 4 hours of sleep and a protein bar." Alfred replied matter-of-factly, "This is all to say, Master Bruce, that you are acting erratically." There was a long pause. "I always act like that, Alfred," the billionaire replied, blue eyes narrowing. Alfred seemed thoroughly unimpressed, fingers twitching enough that Bruce could tell he was trying not to fold his arms. "Master Bruce," he said, something almost irritated leaking into his tone, "I am more than aware of your usual antics, particularly as I have been witness to most of them," he continued before his gaze of pastor softened. "Please, sir, your actions are beginning to border on self-destructive. Alfred, do not let his stupidity and cruelty define you. I understand you feel anger and hurt, sir, but breaking your body is no way to process them." There was a desperate plea bleeding into the words, and for the first time since the incident, Bruce had an overwhelming feeling of love. The honorable, loyal, respectable man before him, looking up through blue eyes, was speaking only from his love for his ward, and that warmed the darker parts of Bruce's soul for a moment, until the clawing sensation that had claimed its place inside his chest opened up its jaws and swallowed that emotion whole. He let out a long breath. "I never meant to make you worry, Alfred," he began quietly, "but this is who I am. This is who I have to be. Batman has to take the risks for Gotham that others can't or won't take. This has nothing to do with him, Alfred." The man suddenly looked incredibly old and tired, as though in one moment his hair turned grayer, his gaze heavier, and his body more frail. "The fact you won't say his name, sir, speaks volumes to how this is very much about him." He paused. "I've spoken my piece, and I know you'll do as you always do. But I can only ask that you find something, anything, else to deal with these emotions, sir, before I end up marrying another Wayne." With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, the clip of his shoes echoing off the empty walls of the manor. Something gnawing clawed at his ribs until he took a deep breath and shook himself. Because Alfred was right. As much as he'd like to deny it, his actions had been somewhat reckless, and dismissing Gordon hadn't happened since he first donned the cowl. So Alfred was right. He needed to deal with the horrible emptiness in his chest, because otherwise he'd end up isolating his last remaining family, and he knew that was something he couldn't allow. So how to deal with a problem that was Superman? Well, Bruce thought, he could kill the alien, although he'd have to compile some serious intelligence before even attempting such a feat. Not to mention it would bring a level of scrutiny to Batman that would not only limit the effectiveness of his alter ego, but also restrict the willingness of law enforcement to either ignore him or work with him. Even those born and raised in the harshness of Gotham, who mocked the awestruck manner in which Metropolis pined after their red and blue hero, would not take kindly to their Dark Knight striking down America's favorite son. So that ruled out permanently removing the alien from his life. He could retire from society for a while until his emotions were under control. But while Bruce Wayne going on an extensive vacation wouldn't be either extraordinary or unexpected, nor would his company be in particular danger with Lucius Fox running the show, he was not going to give Superman the satisfaction of driving him out of his own city, nor out of his well-oiled alias. Not to mention, of course, that Superman would know, or at least assume, that he was the reason behind his departure. That made Bruce's hackles raise instantly. So that was gone too. He could uncover Superman's identity, because there was no way an alien who had been living on Earth for years didn't have a human identity, and ruin him. But Bruce sighed, climbing the stairs to his room. That would be just as problematic. Firstly, Superman would want to know how Bruce uncovered his identity, and Batman, the world's best detective, would be one of a very small number of people with that capability. Secondly, how he'd successfully blackmail an all-powerful alien still escaped him. Thirdly, as with killing the superhero, people might not take pleasure in a Gotham playboy blackmailing Superman, and even less if they discovered Batman was actually behind the Brucey Wayne facade. So that meant he had to consider something more drastic. The thought that came to him was, in a way, inevitable. Not least because his options were limited and Bruce Wayne never did anything. Perhaps. He redefined his life and worldview when he became Batman, snapping off pieces of himself until he was sharp and dangerous enough to punch criminality in the face. He shut out the world by building a wall of secrecy so thick that only he and his surrogate father knew just who the real Bruce Wayne was. There was only one thing left then. Bruce took in a long, steadying breath. In a way, he should probably tell Alfred his intentions, he mused as he began to stoke the dwindling fire with a poker, watching as the embers were spit out. He tossed on a couple of coal lumps and waiting until the heat began to turn the flames white. But Alfred was traditional. He loved deeply and fiercely and cared about the words on his skin. So Bruce wouldn't tell him. The man would find out, that was certain. But there could be anything from days to weeks to years before that happened, and Bruce would have returned to normal long enough for him to cease panicking about his ward's extensive recklessness. He gently shut the door and clicked the lock before pulling his shirt over his head, taking a belt from his wardrobe and setting it between his teeth. The poker he'd left sitting on the coals was glowing bright white. He took another breath, and then, after barely a hesitation, Batman picked up the metal and burned Superman's words off his skin.